Good morning. It is Tuesday, November 6th, Election Day. And this is the drill. Okay, thank you very much. This is Ron, your host, the only true conservative in the United States of America, because I'm the only one that makes the presumption for the status quo. So today is something a little bit different. Monty Python had a movie that was called And Now for Something Completely Different. And so this is going to be much more different than what I normally do. Usually I'm concentrating on conservatives and what they do right or wrong most of the time. This is going to be, I'm going to read from a book that's called Trump Must Go by Bill Press, lefty journalist or commentator, TV commentator. And he wrote a book called Trump Must Go, and it's there's 100 reasons why Trump must go. I'm not going to go through all 100, but there's a little section in here that he calls the 12 biggest lies that Donald Trump has told. It would be foolhardy here to list all the known Donald Trump lies. After he's gone, maybe somebody will publish the collected lies of Donald Trump in 12 volumes. But to make the point, here are some of his greatest hits. 12 whoppers, great and small, about every subject imaginable that stand out from 2017 and 2018. Number 1, on Time magazine, he still claims, quote, "I have been on their cover 14 or 15 times. I think we have the all-time record in the history of Time magazine," unquote. Fact, Trump was on the cover 11 times, Richard Nixon 55 times. Number 2, on Florida 2016, quote, "The Cuban Americans, I got 84% of that vote," unquote. Fact, he actually received 54% of the Cuban American vote. 3, on healthcare, some 60 times he claimed that Obamacare is, quote, "dying," unquote, or, quote, "essentially dead," unquote. Fact, despite all of Trump's attempts to gut it, Obamacare is still very much alive for now, covering over 22 million people. 4, on tax cuts, at least 40 times he bragged about delivering the biggest tax cut in history, and he 50 times claimed the United States pays the highest corporate taxes or is one of the highest tax nations. Fact, according to Trump's own Treasury Department, the GOP tax cut of 2017 is only the 8th largest, and corporations, in fact, after deductions and benefits, pay a far lower rate than many other countries. Number 5, more on tax cuts. No, I don't, quote, "No, I don't benefit. I don't benefit. In fact, very strongly, as you see, I think there's very little benefit for people of wealth," unquote. Fact, since he won't release his tax returns, we don't know how much Donald Trump actually benefits, but according to Vox, 82.8% of the Trump tax cuts go to the top 1%. 6, on 2016 results. Quote, "We got 306 because people came out and voted like they've never seen before. So that's the way it goes. I guess it was the biggest electoral college win since Ronald Reagan," unquote. Fact, as noted above, George H.W. Bush, Bill Clinton, and Barack Obama all won bigger margins in the electoral college. 7, on voter fraud. Trump claimed, quote, "thousands," unquote, of people were, quote, "brought in on the buses," unquote, from Massachusetts to vote in the New Hampshire Republican primary. Fact, the New Hampshire Secretary of State, the Massachusetts Attorney General, and the U.S. Attorney's Office from Boston found zero evidence to support Trump's claim. He keeps repeating it anyway. 8, on Obama. Quote, "Terrible. Just found out that Obama had my wires tapped in Trump Tower just before the victory. Nothing found. This is McCarthyism," unquote. Fact, even though he repeated this charge several times in March 2017, he has produced zero evidence of a wiretap. The Justice Department told Congress that no wiretap on Trump Tower had been sought or authorized. 9, on gun safety. Quote, "When you look at the city with the strongest gun laws in our nation, it's Chicago," unquote. Fact, several other cities, notably New York and Los Angeles, have tougher gun laws. At one time, so did Washington, D.C. 10, on crime. Shortly after taking office, Trump told a group of sheriffs that the murder rate in the United States is the highest it's been in, quote, 45 to 47 years, unquote. Fact, just the opposite. The murder rate today is roughly half of what it was 20 years ago. According to FBI records in 1980, the murder rate was 10.2 per 100,000 people, compared to 5.3 per 100,000 in 2016. 11. On the Muslim ban. Donald Trump blamed the huge crowds of protesters that showed up at airports the day after his Muslim ban on computer problems by Delta Airlines. Quote, only 109 people came out of 325,000 were detained and held for questioning. Big problems at airports were caused by Delta computer outage, unquote. Fact, at least 746 people were detained, and Delta's computer crash happened 2 days later. 12. On the Mueller investigation. As part of his never-ending efforts to discredit special counsel Robert Mueller, Trump often claims, quote, the story that there was a collusion between Russians and Trump campaign was fabricated by Dems as an excuse for losing the election, unquote. Fact, the FBI investigation began months before the election when Trump aide George Papadopoulos was discovered bragging about his secret meetings with Russians. And then he concludes by saying, we're just getting started. As you will see, there are many more reasons why Trump must go. But this may be the most important of all, because once you realize that Donald Trump lies with every breath he takes, and once you know you can't believe a word the President of the United States or anyone else at the White House says, then you've already hit a brick wall. For the basic building block of our political system and the key to getting anything done is trust. Nobody can trust Donald Trump, the liar-in-chief. And you know what? I'm not even going to go ahead and comment on it. I'm just going to leave it at that. So when I come back, I'm going to be reading from the 10 books that screwed up the world and 5 that didn't help. And thank you very much. Welcome back. My mistake. We're going to be reading from the Ayn Rand Lexicon. And today, I think a kind of a timely concept, conservatives versus liberals. Conservatives and liberals hold the same premise. Let me see here. Yeah, both conservatives and liberals hold the same premise, the mind-body dichotomy, but choose opposite sides of this lethal fallacy. The conservatives want freedom to act in the material realm. They tend to oppose government control of production, of industry, of trade, of business, of physical goods, of material wealth. But they advocate government control of man's spirit, i.e. man's consciousness. They advocate the state's right to impose censorship, to determine moral values, to create and enforce a governmental establishment of morality, to rule the intellect. The liberals want freedom to act in the spiritual realm. They oppose censorship. They oppose government control of ideas, of the arts, of the press, of education. Note their concern with academic freedom. But they advocate government control of material production, of business, of employment, of wages, of profits, of all physical property. They advocate it all the way down to total expropriation. The conservatives see man as a body freely roaming the earth, building sand piles or factories with an electronic computer inside his skull, controlled from Washington. The liberals see man as a soul, freewheeling to the farthest reaches of the universe, but wearing chains from nose to toes when he crosses the street to buy a loaf of bread. Yet it is the conservatives who are predominantly religionists, who proclaim the superiority of the soul over the body, who represent what I call the, quote, mystics of spirit, unquote. And it is the liberals who are predominantly materialists, who regard man as an aggregate of meat, and who represent what I call, quote, mystics of muscle, unquote. This is merely a paradox, not a contradiction. Each camp wants to control the realm it regards as metaphysically important. Each grants freedom only to the activities it despises. Observe that the conservatives insult and demean the rich or those who succeed in material production, regarding them as morally inferior, and that the liberals treat ideas as a cynical con game. Control, to both camps, means the power to rule by physical force. Neither camp holds freedom as a value. The conservatives want to rule man's consciousness, the liberals his body. And of course, she's wrong, because she starts with the definition of conservatives and liberals not by essentials, but she is defining them by non-essentials. And the essential difference between conservatives and liberals or socialists is where they stand on change. Conservatives make the presumption for the status quo, and liberals make the presumption for change. So, when we come back, now we will be getting into the 10 books of that screwed up the world and the 5 that didn't help by Benjamin Wiker. Thank you very much. Welcome back. And this is chapter 4 of the book, and this is Discourse on the Origin and Foundations of Inequality Among Men by Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Quote we have from Rousseau to start the chapter: "Savages are not evil precisely because they do not know what it is to be good." Jean-Jacques Rousseau has done so much damage in so many books that it is hard to single out one element, let alone one book for censure. But for our purposes, we can in good conscience zero in on his Discourse on the Origin and Foundations of Inequality Among Men, a cornucopia of profound confusion whose rotting fruit has seeded several generations of subsequent errors. Rousseau loved romance, disliked labor, and even more than anything, despised even the smallest hint of authority that might make him beholden to some master, no matter how mild or reasonable. That accounts for his difficulty in holding any position for very long. It was also largely because of this loathing of authority that he was for the most part self-taught, reading intensely and indiscriminately. As a result, Rousseau combined brilliant and original insights with embarrassing and harmful blunders. One illustration to demonstrate the point: Rousseau adored music and fancied himself to be quite gifted. But because he was self-taught and perhaps had mild dyslexia, he had great trouble reading standard musical notation. He decided to invent his own system of notation, thinking that this ingenious improvement would make him rich and famous. After he presented it to the prestigious Academy of Sciences, the teachers there pointed out to him that although the new notation of the melody was quite creative, it could not represent harmony. A rather obvious drawback, but relatively harmless. However, Rousseau made the same kind of mistake when attempting to work out ingenious improvements in political philosophy. As these affected real people, they were quite harmful indeed. And I did want to say that what he's demonstrating here is the left-wing idea that there's nothing wrong with the individual. They'll tell you all day long, there's nothing wrong with you, it's the rest of the world. And that's what Rousseau did. He says, nothing wrong with me. If I can't read the notation, it's because there's something wrong with the musical notation. It's not me that has to change, it's the musical notation. Okay, that's the recipe for revolution. Nothing wrong with me, it's the rest of the world. So we need to have a revolution, have a perfect society, and then everything will be better. Back to the book. At the age of 38, Rousseau finally achieved fame, winning an essay competition in 1750 offered by the Academy of Dijon. The Academy proposed the question, has the restoration of the sciences and arts tended to purify morals? Rousseau's answer, given in his Discourse on the Sciences and Arts, no. The more civilized we become, the more corrupt we become. He claimed that the advance of sciences and arts took people away from their original natural purity and happiness, making them both softer and more elaborately vicious. The same is true, he argued, even for the art of government. While government laws provide for our safety, they take away our original liberty so that we become happy slaves with delicate and refined taste who have a softness of character and urbanity of customs that give the semblance of all the virtues without the possession of any. We would all be infinitely more virtuous, asserted Rousseau, if we were noble and rustic Romans, or even better, noble but entirely uncultured savages. The good man is an athlete who likes to compete in the nude. So spoke Rousseau in his first discourse. Rousseau's second discourse, properly titled Discourse on the Origin and Foundations of Inequality Among Men, was an expansion of this theme. It was written in response to yet another question posed by the Academy of Dijon, this time in 1754. What is the origin of inequality among men, and is it authorized by natural law? This time Rousseau didn't win the prize. His essay generously exceeded the required length, but it did win lasting fame when Rousseau had it published the following year. I called the second discourse a cornucopia of profound confusion. The word cornucopia should awaken us to the richness and overflowing abundance of Rousseau's work. Even as we demonstrate its confusion, we should not underestimate its profundity. Simple-minded errors rarely engender great historical results, and Rousseau's was no simple mind. One finds in him, for good or ill, the seeds of romanticism and folk nationalism, the French Revolution and totalitarianism, Marx and Nietzsche, Freud and Darwin, modern anthropology and Margaret Mead, the sexual revolution and the dissolution of the family, all marked with what is characteristically Rousseau, genius and blunder. Excuse me. Let's pursue both. Rousseau used the Academy's question about inequality as a pretext to push his reasoning in the first discourse to the extreme. In an effort to find natural man as he is in the state of nature, the philosophers who have examined the foundations of society have all felt the necessity of going back to the state of nature, but none of them has reached it, declared Rousseau, obviously having Thomas Hobbes' efforts in mind, as well as those of John Locke. So a couple of things. First of all, as he was noting here, one finds in him, for good or ill, the seeds of romanticism, French Revolution, totalitarianism, Marx, Nietzsche, Freud, Darwin, and it's again showing how ideas can influence other people and other ideas. Because you get into Margaret Mead and the sexual revolution, which happened in the 1960s, 200 years later. So 200 years later, there are people, thinkers, that are still influenced by what it is that Rousseau wrote. And then in his the author's other paragraph, when they're talking about have examined the foundation of society and felt the necessity of going back to the state of nature, what he's really talking about is the influence again of Descartes. I was going to say Cartesian, but anyways, of René Descartes, whom the author he's covered René Descartes' book in an earlier chapter. And Descartes was basically responsible for, instead of following his predecessors up like St. Thomas Aquinas did. St. Thomas Aquinas took into consideration, when he was creating his philosophical theories, into consideration the ideas of people that were born and lived and died 1,500 years before he did. Okay, so using foundation and other people, learning from other folks. And Descartes basically said, no, we throw all that in the garbage and we start all over again. And this is pretty much the same thing Rousseau is doing right here when he talks about reverting to a state of nature. He's talking about going back to zero, throwing everything in the garbage and starting over, instead of saying, okay, we live in a modern society. Maybe at one point, human beings were savages, if you believe the anthropology. But so what? We don't live like that anymore, and the decisions that we have to make have to be made in the present. They can't be made in the past. So we have to make those decisions in the present. And so that brings us to the conclusion of another episode of The Drill. And thank you for listening. And until next time, have a great day.